This week, we welcome Neal Bridges, Chief Information Security Officer at Query.AI, to discuss the contrasting role of the CISO at startups versus enterprises. In the Leadership and Communications section, CISOs embrace a common business language to report on cybersecurity, the strategic impact of Verizon's 2022 data breach investigations report, make shy employees part of your cybersecurity strategy, and more. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly.
Cloud security compliance doesn't have to be complicated. Whether your business is migrating to the cloud or a seasoned cloud service provider, BAR Advisory can help you simplify security and compliance frameworks, including SOC, ISO, and HITRUST. As an extension of your team, BAR specialists will put your people first and empower them with the knowledge and tools needed to stay secure and compliant at every stage of your business growth. Learn how BAR can help your company build trust with consumers and become cyber resilient at securityweekly.com/BAR Advisory. That's BARR Advisory.
Cyber criminals are working overtime. Last year in the fourth quarter alone, phishing attacks disguised as COVID testing information increased by 521%. Barracuda has identified 13 types of email threats and how cyber criminals use them to steal money from your company or personal information from your employees and customers. Find out about the 13 email threat types and how Barracuda can provide complete email protection for your teams, your customers, and your reputation. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. It's time to rethink how we approach cybersecurity because the reality is modern cyber attackers are already past your initial defenses. ExtraHop helps your security team find and eradicate advanced threats before real damage is done. Protect your enterprise and customers with better defense. Learn more about how ExtraHop stops advanced threats at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. That's extra HOP.
Welcome to Business Security Weekly. This is episode number 271, recorded August 1st, 2022. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me are my co-hosts remotely today. First, Mr. Jason Albuquerque. Welcome, Jason.
Hey, what's going on, Matt? We finally got some rain here in New England. It's been jungle hot for the last couple of weeks. It's been sweltering. We finally got some rain. I don't know. My grass is so brown, I don't think this is going to revive it, honestly.
Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review those suggestions often and will reach out to you once reviewed. Neal Bridges brings more than 2 decades of cybersecurity experience to his role as Chief Information Security Officer at Query.AI, where he is responsible for leading the company's security strategy and operations and guiding product development efforts to help customers achieve their desired security outcomes. Throughout his career, Neal has helped federal and commercial organizations develop and execute cybersecurity strategies and has built teams at multiple Fortune 100 companies. Neal is the founder of Cyber Insecurity Podcast, where he discusses the latest cyber news and trends and gives career advice to listeners who are new to the cybersecurity industry. Neal, welcome to Business Security Weekly.
Thanks, Matt, Jason, and Ben for having me. I really do appreciate it. It's an honor to be here.
It's always good to have a fellow podcaster on. We don't really cover the news on this one because we talk leadership and communication, but that's okay. They can check out the news, I guess, on your podcast.
Absolutely. And I try to give a no BS kind of assessment as to what's happening in the world. You know that there's so much hype and FUD and marketing stuff that goes on behind most of these podcasts that happen out there that we try to be really straight and direct and to the point.
Love it. So do we. It's been our philosophy here at Security Weekly for a very long time. All right. So we're going to talk about the CISO role and how it contrasts between startups and enterprises. Let me guess. Resources, budgets, culture. Like, where do we start?
I mean, you've named all the easy ones. Obviously, we really could start anywhere. I think that's the beauty of it, is that I don't think many people oftentimes understand the depth of differences that exist out there. As a matter of fact, I would even argue, and I did a piece on this recently. Most people still think that you don't need a CISO until you get to a certain revenue model or a certain number of customers or a certain funding stage when you're out there doing the funding value. And it's amazing to see just how much the CISO can actually have a positive impact on an organization, early stage startup, versus waiting until you've got to deal with some of these big enterprise issues and realizing that it's too late.
Yeah, I imagine so. So what is that threshold? Is one? How many employees do you need before you need a CISO, Neal?
And again, I don't think it's fair to talk in absolutes, because I think every organization has to value it differently. But what I would say is that you made an interesting point when you read out my bio. You talked about the product management side of that, and I think that's interesting to key in on, because when you typically think CISO, you typically think about the cybersecurity sides of things. But when you're looking at some of these early stage startups, I think a lot of folks who are building inside the security space are missing the need of having a CISO that can also act as a SME. When you start talking about the decades of experience, that most CISOs bring to the table, that decades of experience can then also come and help drive a lot of the product influence and make sure that it's actually solving real world needs that you're trying to go to market with. And we talk a little bit about the marketing FUD that comes in with some of these security companies that come out on the space. And I think that it adds a lot of credence to your product development. So outside of just the cybersecurity responsibilities that a CISO can have, that product management, or not necessarily product management, but at least product SME and product influence role, I think is equally as important to that job description. So to answer your question more directly, I think once you've gotten to a phase where you're starting to reach out, get clients, whether it's for a beta or a design partner phase, once you're actually out there interfacing with a broader populace, I think is really time to really have that conversation, because you're probably going to start getting third-party risk forms from potential clients. You're going to start having to have SOC 2 compliance requirements that you're going to have to meet. And then on top of that, having that validation from that SME from a product perspective is going to be instrumental to your success as a startup.
Yeah. And Neal, I mean, a lot of folks, when you start having conversations around the need for having a cybersecurity expert, whether it be a CISO, on an FTE type basis, that's not always necessarily the case. I've seen a lot of organizations who start their way down the path with a contractor. They'll bring in a third party who acts as a staff augmentation in the CISO role. They'll spend 3 days a week working for them, and then eventually they mature to getting to the point where they need a full-time CISO. So they'll ease their way into it, and at the same time have that expertise there waiting, and helping them along the way, and being that product management resource and cybersecurity and compliance resource.
I think that's fair. I have a love-hate relationship with this concept of vCISO, which I think is what you're describing, right? I think if you look at the vCISO, to your point, as a long-tail contractor that ultimately gives you a stepping stone into an FTE sitting in that role, I think it's fair if used right. One of the things that I caution folks on when they start to look at the vCISO role is that those folks are not typically vested personally necessarily in the success or failure of your business. And on top of that, you're competing for time with an unknown number of other potential consultees that they're dealing with as well. And so I think it just depends on where you're at in that development cycle, where maybe you're early on and you only want maybe 5 to 10 hours worth of consulting on a monthly basis that you can afford. But I think that oftentimes becomes kind of like my internal risk suggestion that I give to folks is, where are you at in that development cycle?
Yeah. Again, I mentioned it as a staff augmentation role, not an FTE, right? Because you have to mature into that full-time employee role, having someone on staff. But if it, I consider no action an action, and if you have nothing, you're in a very bad spot, right? So
one is always greater than zero, right?
You got it, 100%. So if the appetite of the organization is that they don't want to invest in an FTE, bring the case to the table of, hey, listen, let's bring someone on a few days a week in a consultative role, and then we can mature into having a full-time CISO.
Yeah, and I think what I would add to that, suggestion as well is have an exit strategy that says when we reach this point, this is when we're going to mature up to that FTE.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Create that milestone, right? That once you take
That's
that
right. That's
milestone,
right.
you flip.
Have a nice clear line in the sand. Otherwise, you'll end up with a lot of scope creep, and it'll end up dragging out for a lot longer than you probably intend for it
makes
to.
total sense.
Yeah, and I think maturity is part of this. Obviously, you got to set those milestones, Neal. But the role differs a little bit. When I think about a startup, I think part of that is more outbound CISO versus inbound CISO a little bit, right? Because you're there to help customers answer questions around the security of the platform, potentially if you're in the product space, right? Because I know a lot of the CISOs, and Ben was in this role for a while, they're more evangelistic, outbound kind of CISOs, where when you get to the enterprise, you're thinking more inbound, internal structures as well. So how does the role kind of differ between the skill set you're looking for in a startup versus an enterprise? Because I think the outbound versus inbound is part of that equation, right?
I think that's a fantastic point, but I want to disagree with you. I think that the inbound is just as important as a startup phase as the outbound is. I'll give you a case in point. There is a stigma that we have when we go to talk about CISOs and we go to talk about their role in enterprises, oftentimes being obstructionist. We oftentimes are the office of the no. We've got this really bad stigma that kind of comes along with us when we talk about having a CISO, especially in the enterprise. I had a CISO, really good mentor of mine, a number of years ago that I worked for, who said that our role really is to enable the business to take risk. And that's a lot harder to get across to an enterprise that's a few thousand people. You'd be surprised how easy it is to get that message across to an organization that maybe 15, 20, or 25 people. And I can unequivocally tell you that if you actually position yourself with the development teams, because you're probably going to be very development friendly if we go back to a product-focused business where you've got 65% of your organization is engineers or developers, where you can actually be a partner with those engineers and a partner with those developers to build security as a culture from the ground up versus waiting, until you get to that point where you're like, okay, I'm done being the evangel. Now I'll look internal to handle my enterprise security. You absolutely can and should be doing them both in parallel, and you'll actually create a culture of security inside your organization when you start small.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Neal. I mean, that's how I built my career. I was an internal enterprise CISO who started getting pulled into sales meetings and customer facing meetings and, becoming an evangelist for cybersecurity for the organization. And, I would have sales executives come in and be like, wow, you're such a great salesperson. You really know how to evangelize. And I'm like, my answer to them is no. I know the operations of this organization. I have confidence in it, so I can portray that confidence. And if that's a sales tool, so be it. But it's because I can speak to the reality of what we bring to the table. So walk the walk.
And it's because you focused internally and you said, I'm going to build this culture up. We've had meetings with our devs. We've hired exponentially our dev force over the last 6 months here at Query, and I have meetings with our devs and we have security meetings. We talk about changes that we're going to have from a security perspective. We talk about how can I not necessarily tell you no, but when you tell me what it is that you need, how do I tell you, okay, this is how we get there. This is how we get there in a secure fashion. And we've created a real partnership between security and development that, to your point, this is the excellent point. I can go to our customers and feel incredibly confident about what we're doing from a security perspective. When I have to do those TPRM forms, I know everything about our infrastructure, and it makes it super easy and super confident for me to fill out 100%. Exactly.
Yeah, love filling out those third-party risk management forms for all those.
That is literally, I hate it. I will make fun of TPRM all day long.
That's where I started my compliance career years ago. And I think you talk about this a little bit, compliance does not equal security. So, when you're in the enterprise, right, sometimes compliance was the primary driver. How do you manage through that shift? Because I think that's a very interesting shift for the CISO is if you're highly regulated and compliance is the tail that wags that dog. How do you shift from that mindset to a real security mindset and figuring out how security becomes the primary driver for the program and not compliance?
And again, maybe I think this is easier in a startup than it is in it. When you look at some of the Fortune 100 companies that I've worked for in the past, compliance is definitely what the tail that wags that dog, as you put it. But it's oftentimes easier to push an enterprise towards compliance because everybody can nod their head up and down and say, yes, I need to do this. GDPR, everybody came together when it came to GDPR and recognized that they had to do it because of a 15% penalty. CCPA, same situation. If you're regulated in financial industry, everybody knows that you have to do PCI DSS. And so everybody nods their head up and down and says, yes, I have to do this. When you get down to a smaller company like a startup, I personally don't think that is as big of a deal in a smaller startup because, to your point, if you're participating with the teams, if you're enabling them to take risks, if you're making their jobs easier and you're not trying to put up a bunch of boundaries and put up a bunch of no's and trying to inhibit their ability to do product development, you can actually teach them how to do security by design, security in their SDLC lifecycle, security as a daily practice, and that actually makes the compliance conversation much easier. We're obviously going through our SOC 2 here at Query, and I can tell you that it's easier for me to complete SOC 2 with an organization that when I say, no, we must have MFA on everything, they do it just like that because they understand that security is important. And so I would argue that all the things that a typical CISO tries to accomplish in 3 years at an organization, because let's be realistic, right? The 3-year life cycle is still very, very real in CISO life. You get 1 year to kind of get your feet underneath you, get a feel for the land, develop your strategy, figure out what it is you're going to do in an organization, pick 1 or 2 things that you're going to try to be successful at. Year 2, you're hauling tail, trying to make those 1 or 2 things as successful as possible. And then the last year, you're planning your exit strategy so that you can leave before there's a breach, before you get, pigeonholed into a corner that you're not going to be able to do anything else, right? That's very much life in that world. And I think that you have more of an opportunity to say, I want to do secure by design. I want to do SDLC the right way. I want to have, code, scanning built into my repositories from the ground up, MFA across the board. I want to have all my endpoints, including everything that's in my server infrastructure with EDR on them, right? All the things that you want to do, inventory, software bills of material. You have an opportunity to do that in a startup from ground zero, which I think you'll never, ever, ever be able to achieve in some of these larger enterprises.
Yeah, it'll take those last 2 years to even begin to execute on things in a larger organization because of the bureaucracy, because of all the political pieces of the puzzle, and it takes forever to accomplish. It's moving that proverbial ship in the ocean, right? I mean, the aircraft carrier. So absolutely correct. You're more agile and more nimble in a startup.
And I think that sets a different mindset when you think about that from a career perspective. There's a lot of folks who are out there like, I want to work for insert big company name here because I want to get those chops of being a CISO for big company name here. But then think about that for a second. So you want to work at a company where you might achieve one goal for that organization. Maybe it's MFA, which should have been done from ground zero. Maybe it's an SDLC, which should have been done from ground zero. Maybe it's some of these basic things that should have been done from ground zero. You can do one of those at a big company, or you can go work for a startup and build it how you want. And I think there's a little bit of that. Oh gosh, if I start to think about it this way, there's a lot of opportunity for you to set some really good precedents in your career by taking that experience and applying it in an agile fashion in a startup. You're going to work twice as hard. Like literally, I do everything from help desk to presenting to the board. And I think that's the other thing that you talk about how many, what are some of the things that you have to do at a startup? But I wouldn't trade it for the world because I can literally build this thing in my image of cybersecurity instead of having to pitch for 1 or 2 objectives a year.
How much pushback do you get in a startup environment around budgets? Look, I've been through these, right? It's all about revenue, cash flow, right? Yeah. And so getting the investment sometimes in the startup, and I don't know that it's much better in the enterprise, by the way, but I could see, getting some of that investment being a little tight, a little challenging in a startup. Oh, yeah. I mean, how do you address that?
No, very valid. And I think that this is what makes the challenge. We talk about the thrill of the hunt, right? If you go back and look at my career, I started out very, very fortunate when I was leading security operations for a Fortune 100 company. I had a $50 million budget to run security operations. Like I wanted for nothing other than more SIM license, but that's a different story. But for most part, I wanted for nothing. I then went from there to a food and beverage company. And I had to build the exact same security operations team with the exact same capabilities that I built at the other company, but I had a $12 million budget to do that. So less than 50%. But we still did it. We still thought outside the box. We still looked at innovative ways to do things. And we built more capabilities with that company than we did at the other one because we had a bunch of people sit around and say, how do we solve this problem? And now I'm here at a startup where I effectively have like a few $1,000s a month or a few $1,000s a year that I could spend on security. But you know what I'm doing? I'm putting my head down and saying, okay, what can I do? What is in my toolbox? What does exist out there? What is the art of the possible given what I've got? And so what I think people get hung up on when we talk about budgets is there's this idea in our head that says I have to have X budget to provide X amount of security. And I think that that's where people get messed up when they start talking about budgets. The budget conversation is really about what money do you need to make the business agile, profitable, and secure the mission for where they're at right now. And when you realize that you don't have to have a SIM, you don't have to have crazy OneTrust, type of infrastructure. You don't have to have all these big things that you want to try to put in place at a big enterprise when you can start small with what do you need to do the mission today? And you go to the executive leadership and you go to the board of directors and you say, I don't need $1 million. As a matter of fact, I'll take whatever scraps I can get off the table and I'll still do it as good as I did in a Fortune 100 company. The amount of clout that you can have when you go to that conversation, I think is amazing. And so what I would say to people is stop thinking in terms of budget, that money is going to solve your problem. As a matter of fact, this is a little bit of a soapbox item for me. There was a recent article out that said that money, it has been proven that money does not make organizations more secure. And that is very, very true. And so I would argue that it's not about how much money you have. You realize how many tools are built into, if you're a SaaS product company, how many tools are built into AWS for you to secure your infrastructure? How many tools are built into GitHub for you to secure your code, right? There is a lot that you can do on a shoestring budget in a startup that if people would get out of their own heads, I think they'd be amazed at how much security they could actually put in place.
Neal, you're dead on. I mean, what was just going through my head was, we have so many overlaps in our security platforms these days, where in many instances, if you go out and you have Microsoft E5 licensing already, because you're in the Microsoft ecosphere, you get all of those security tools. And hey, by the way, you'd have your SIM too, because they have Sentinel now on the back end. You can start taking advantage of that. And hey, a lot of the O365 ingestion is free, right? So yes, you can get off out of that gate with security tools in play, with just realizing the economies of scale you have with the licensing you've already bought.
And it is a lot of hard work, and I don't mean to say that it's not. I mean, I'm a one-man show running security for a Series A company in addition to everything else that we've got going on. But if you're down for that type of work and you can realize the value you can bring to an organization, to your point about proving, all the things that we know that happen in enterprise, tool overlap, tools being on the shelf and not getting used, right? When you have to learn to live off the land, so to speak, with what you've been given from a startup and you're actually successful, you'll realize now, I think, I've said this about folks that I mentor on cyber and security, where I think everybody should start as incident response because you learn so much about the enterprise that you'll grow up and be a really good cyber practitioner. I think every CISO should start in a startup because when you realize how successful you can be living off the land, you will be a better enterprise CISO every day of the week.
You're forced to adopt the tools you're investing in. Right. So many organizations adopt 20% of the capabilities of their tools, where now you're forced to adopt, 80, 90% of the capability.
And you know what? If you're mindful and you are realizing to Matt's point that you can't go and ask for $1 million for X, you will make it work and you will make it secure and it'll be just fine.
So Neal, then that means budget should not be an excuse for enterprises to implement cybersecurity programs, but yet we see challenges on enterprises implementing programs. You can't blame money at that point, because if you can scrap and pull it together with your Microsoft E5 or open source components, there's no excuse at the enterprise other than executive management buy-in.
What I've always said is that our problem at the enterprise level is that we have a bunch of nerds who don't know how to talk business. What I try to coach everybody on is if you want to be a better cybersecurity person, scratch all the technical stuff that you can learn and go get a business degree, right? until we solve the ability for enterprise CISOs to be able to speak better business language to CIOs, to CFOs, and to the board, I think that this is where everybody thinks money solves all problems, and it doesn't. There isn't, we've outlined here just on this conversation all the problems that come with technology. But I'm a firm believer, right? It's people, process, technology in that order. Right? Technology is the last thing that you should be solving for in your security stack, right? You fix your people problem, you have better processes, and then once you feel confident in those two, then you can look at your technology and see where gaps are. And I think we have a lot of CISOs who, and again, I think it varies, right? They've come from different walks of life's of background, and I don't think that they have spent time in the saddle. They haven't spent time as an analyst. They haven't spent time responding to incidents. They haven't spent time doing pen tests or doing threat hunting or doing, GRC level work. They haven't spent time in that saddle. And so I think that they get inundated with, vendor reach outs and marketing emails and RSA presentations and black hat presentations that say this will solve your problems. And they go, I just need to go pitch for $1 million from the board to get that, and it'll solve my problem. And so they've flipped that dichotomy around, and I think that's the blinders that has been put on a lot of organizations, is not focusing on the people and the process first.
It
does not.
Yeah, it does not, and we're gonna cover this in the data breach report from Verizon because it's the same things. Yeah. It is the people side of this, right? The reason I'm doing what I'm doing now, because I love it, is trying to solve the human problem. This is a people problem first. When you look at the stats and you look at the breakdown of where the attacks are being propagated from, it's all coming from us. It's account takeovers, it's clicking on malicious emails or websites, clicking the phishing, like it's all people based. But yet we spend all this money on technology. Now I'm on my soapbox for a second. We spend all this money on technology to try to protect everything around the human, but then we don't know how to educate the human. We don't know how to help the human be better in their job so that they don't do that, which opens up all the doors. And so you're right. It is a people, process, technology in that order problem. And I think a lot of enterprise CISOs go after the technology. Yep. They spend lots of money, but it's not really moving the needle. And that's why the session's so interesting to me, is because if you can do it at a startup without those large budgets, it's not a budget problem anymore.
And to your point, when you're at a startup, when you've got 10, 15, 20, 30, 50, maybe even 100 people that you're working for at a startup, it's a lot easier to build that culture of security. And guess what happens? Somebody else comes in, they get inundated with that culture of security. The teams get bigger, they adopt that culture of security. And what you end up with is now you're an organization that is secure by design, that is cultural by design, that is security is ingrained in your bloodstream. Now, that doesn't mean that you're never going to have a breach, you're never going to have issues and incidents. That's not what I'm here to pitch. But at least from a CISO perspective, you don't have to try to infuse that into an organization when you come in after the fact.
And guys, that people problem is not just end user cyber awareness. It's not just teaching developers to infuse security in the SDLC process, but it's also educating the other executives in your organization. That's part of your people problem in your education as well, is educate the executives, educate the board, educate the CEO, because that's when you start getting that top-down support. And then it truly becomes a culture. When your board of directors and your CEO are talking the talk, and speaking that mutual language that you have back and forth between the CISO and the board and the executives, now you're winning, right? Because you're handling it at every level.
Let me piggyback on that a little bit, because I think there's a nuance to that. You're not wrong, but I want to add an additional nuance to that. Enterprise CISOs lose a lot of trust in that education process because they bite off too much of the apple. They overcommit. They don't understand the culture of their organization. And so what they end up doing is they say, I'm going to do these 5 projects this year. And then maybe they actually really only get 2 done because of all the red tape and the politicking, everything else that goes in. And so then they start to lose that trust of their executive team and their senior leadership. And on top of that, they're being asked for business metrics. How is vulnerability management going to impact the dev team? What should I be concerned about? Oh gosh, now we've had an incident and we haven't had communication. There's a lot more challenges to build that trust. And I know a lot of CISOs who have failed the test of being an enterprise CISO because they failed to maintain trust. And this is, again, we talk about contrasting with over a startup. You're a small team. Like you have no choice but to talk to your executive team 3, 4, 5 times a week at every juncture. Like you're going to build that rapport and you're going to build that trust. And that makes it easier for me to say, hey, look, we really shouldn't do this thing because that's fundamentally insecure. We should find a different way to do it. And now you have that small team mentality, that almost that Navy SEAL spec ops mentality where everybody trusts everybody else to make a decision. And that's something that's harder to build in an enterprise than it is in a startup.
You're speaking the language of what we talk about in the second segment every time we do BSW, right? It's communication and leadership. That's what we talk about the entire time. And Matt, how often do we talk about trust, right? It's the foundation of every relationship. We talk about it all the time.
Neal, when you think about some tips for people that want to become CISOs and get an opportunity to go in, like where should they focus? Like what are some of the tips of the trade that will help them if they get into one of those positions? Because I think, look, there's a lot of people that listen to the show that may not be in the chair but want to get to the chair. And when they get there, what is it they should really focus on to be successful? Because I think that's probably the biggest challenge for first-time CISOs. Like, I haven't been here before. What are those like 2 or 3 things that I should really focus on to be successful?
So one of the biggest things that I talk to folks about is when you're down at the tactical, operational, technical levels, there's very much a fear of losing that about yourself and that fear of stepping into management. Like, oh gosh, I don't know that I could ever be a manager. I don't know if I could ever be a people leader. I think the first boundary that everybody who is thinking about it has to overcome is that kind of that self identification that to be a CISO, you have to embrace that. Now, let me make something expressly clear. That does not mean that you have to forego all your technical skills. I myself have spent a lot of my personal time making sure that I maintain my technical skills. I still do penetration testing. I still do, look, I'm a one-man show, but yet I'm in, AWS console every day doing AWS security architecture and configurations, right? And so I make it a point to myself to do that. But you have to have that switch in your head that says, I've got to start adopting management principles. I got to start thinking about people. I got to start thinking about budgets. I got to start thinking about the P word that everybody hates, right? Politics. You got to start thinking about the politics. And so you've got to start shifting your mindset away from the technical things that you've clung to for your expertise for however many number of years. And so I think that is the biggest hurdle that people have to overcome in themselves when they say, I want to go be a CISO. I think after that, to the points that you made earlier, Jason, it's communication, right? And to start doing communication, you have to start putting yourself out there. Now, whether that's something as simple as going to speak at a conference, going to speak on podcasts like BSW, whether that's inside your organization, asking your leadership for more opportunities to go speak in front of other executives across the organization. But you need to find a way to get your voice out there so that you can be, and this is what's going to upset a lot of people, so that you can be told you're wrong, so that you could be shut down, so that you could be openly criticized for the things that you say. Because until you get slapped in the head a couple of times for having bad things to say in front of other executives, you're not going to have the learnings that you need to be ready to sit in that chair. And so I think that there's a little bit of a painful mountain that you have to climb, where every mistake that you've made in your career to now will seem small and insignificant compared to the pain that you have to look forward to sit in that chair. And I think that it takes a special mentality to sit back and say, I'm ready to adopt that pain. I want to give a really quick story. I thought I was CISO one time. I thought I was ready to be CISO one time. And I went out and I interviewed for CISO roles. And I realized how, and I was going from one Fortune 100 company to, I interviewed for three CISO roles at 3 other Fortune 10 companies. They were huge companies. I was not prepared for the level of politics that it took to be CISO at those roles. And it hit me in the gut after those interview processes that I was not ready for the role at that point in time. And I actually did. I took a step back and I said, you know what? I'm gonna sit on this one for a little bit because I'm not ready. And so it does take a little bit of that gut punch for you to see that it's vastly different than any role that you've ever had in your entire career.
Well, one piece of advice I always tell aspiring CISOs or technology leaders is find an executive sponsor or mentor that you can work with as well, right? Because now you can start bouncing questions and have someone who's sat in the chair who can speak the language of the business and really kind of guide you through that as you start maturing through your career. Just having that someone that you can get advice from and they can mentor you is a huge benefit as well.
Absolutely. I think mentorship is something that is beneficial throughout your entire career. I think where a lot of people fail in that executive mentorship, though, is, some mentors are too nice. They're too nice. Just go do this thing. Just go do Toastmasters. Just go do a YouTube video, right? That'll be fine for you. And I don't think it gives you, I mean, both of you, I'm sure, have had those moments where you've sat in front of the board and said something and the board looks at you and you're kind of like, I don't think that that's right, guys. And that's a different gut punch than I think most people are used to. And I would only say that, yes, everybody should have a mentor. Mentorship is incredibly important, but there are some gut punches that are just going to take experience to get.
In that mentorship, someone who's going to be candid, someone who's going to be straightforward, and someone who's going to give you a realistic view of what they think, right? Yeah. You don't want the soft shoe, right? You want someone who's going to come in and give you the reality. So that mentorship needs to be that. Sometimes you need tough love.
You always need tough love. Yes.
I have a few war wounds, bruises, scrapes, scars. Trust me. Oh, yes. Neal, thank you so much for joining us on Business Security Weekly.
Thank you very much.
We're going to take a quick break and then cover the leadership and communications articles for this week.